High in the freezing, snow-covered peaks of the Austrian Alps, a quiet, unassuming country doctor sat inside a warm wooden cabin, sipping a cup of hot tea. It was the middle of May, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for several days. Down in the valleys below, the cities of the Third Reich were reduced to smoldering ash. Millions of men were marching into crowded prisoner-of-war camps. The world was entirely upside down, but up here, hidden away in the breathtaking beauty of the mountains, everything was perfectly peaceful. The doctor was a polite, highly educated man. He wore simple civilian clothes. He possessed flawless medical identification papers proving his identity. He lived a quiet life, entirely removed from the devastating global conflict that had just torn the continent apart. Or, at least, that is exactly what he wanted the world to believe. Suddenly, the heavy crunch of military boots broke the silence of the mountain. A small patrol of exhausted, heavily armed American infantrymen from the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps emerged from the freezing fog. They surrounded the wooden cabin. The Americans knocked on the heavy wooden door. When the polite, soft-spoken doctor opened it, he looked at the dirt-covered American soldiers with a look of mild annoyance. He presented his medical papers. He spoke in a calm, highly sophisticated tone, demanding that the soldiers leave his private medical sanctuary in peace. For a moment, the American soldiers hesitated. The man's disguise was absolutely flawless. His documents were perfectly forged. The American GIs were tired, freezing, and ready to apologize and walk away. But then, a single, microscopic mistake occurred. A mistake so incredibly foolish that it instantly unraveled the greatest disguise in modern military history. In the blink of an eye, the polite country doctor's elaborate illusion shattered. The Americans raised their rifles. The man's face went completely pale, because the American soldiers suddenly realized they were not talking to a humble country doctor. They were standing face to face with Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the absolute highest-ranking surviving leader of the SS, the second most powerful man in the entire Nazi security apparatus, and one of the most feared men on the face of the earth. The story of how this terrifying architect of the regime was brought to his knees by a handful of ordinary American soldiers is a masterpiece of psychological justice. To understand the sheer, breathtaking satisfaction of his capture, you must first understand the terrifying shadow this man cast over the entire continent of Europe. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not a battlefield general. He did not command tanks, and he did not fight in the trenches. He operated entirely in the dark. Standing an imposing 6 feet 4 inches tall, Kaltenbrunner was a physically terrifying figure. His face was marked with deep, aggressive dueling scars from his university days, giving him the permanent look of a movie villain. But his true power lay in his mind, and his total lack of human empathy. He was the chief of the Reich Main Security Office. He answered directly to Heinrich Himmler. Kaltenbrunner was the man who oversaw the secret state police, the Gestapo, and the vast, horrific network of the concentration camps. He was the ultimate bureaucrat of terror. When high-ranking German generals whispered in fear about the secret police listening to their conversations, it was Kaltenbrunner they were afraid of. He had spent the last 4 years projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable invincibility. He viewed himself as the supreme judge of the German people, a master of the master race. But as the spring of 1945 arrived, and the Allied armies began closing the steel trap around Germany, the fearless master of the secret police experienced a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure cowardice. Kaltenbrunner realized that the Allied intelligence agencies knew exactly who he was. He knew that his name was at the very top of the most wanted list. He knew that if the Americans, the British, or the Soviets caught him, he would not be treated as a prisoner of war. He would be put on trial for his life. So the man who had spent years ordering his men to fight to the death, the man who had ruthlessly punished any German soldier who dared to retreat, decided to run. In late April, as the American Third Army tore through southern Germany, Kaltenbrunner completely abandoned his post. He stripped off his terrifying black uniform with the silver insignia. He abandoned the very men who had sworn loyalty to him. He gathered a massive fortune of stolen gold, forged a completely fake set of civilian identification papers under the name Dr. Ernst Unterberger, and fled deep into the Austrian Alps. His plan was brilliant in its arrogance. He believed that the American military was entirely too naive to catch him. He thought the American GIs were just uneducated farm boys who would take one look at his forged medical documents and leave him alone. He intended to wait out the chaotic aftermath of the war in the comfortable, warm cabin of his mistress, far away from the ashes of the empire he had helped destroy. He firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire world. But the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps was not made up of naive amateurs. They were methodical, relentless, and completely immune to the arrogant charms of the German elite. By the second week of May, the Americans received a faint, unconfirmed tip from local Austrian informants. They heard rumors that a highly suspicious, tall man claiming to be a doctor was hiding in a remote cabin near the town of Altaussee. A small detachment of American GIs, accompanied by intelligence officers, began the grueling trek up the freezing mountain. These American soldiers were exhausted. They had fought their way across Europe. They had survived artillery barrages, freezing snowstorms, and deadly urban combat. They were covered in weeks of dirt and sweat. They did not look like polished detectives. When they finally reached the remote cabin and knocked on the door, Kaltenbrunner initiated the performance of a lifetime. When he opened the door, he looked at the muddy, tired American soldiers with an expression of polite bewilderment. He spoke in a soft, educated tone. He introduced himself as Dr. Unterberger. He presented his medical bag. He showed them his perfectly forged identification papers, complete with official stamps. He acted deeply offended that heavily armed soldiers were interrupting his vital medical work in the mountains. He played the role of the innocent, inconvenienced civilian with absolute perfection. The American soldiers examined the paperwork. The forged documents were incredibly convincing. The story made sense. In the chaos of the post-war weeks, thousands of displaced civilians and doctors were hiding in the mountains. The American intelligence officers exchanged uncertain glances. They were freezing. They were tired. The man standing in front of them did not act like a cornered, fanatical SS commander. He acted like a harmless, educated gentleman. The Americans were just seconds away from handing the forged papers back, apologizing for the intrusion, and walking back down the mountain. Kaltenbrunner's massive ego swelled. He had done it. He had successfully manipulated the American army. But then, the universe intervened. Just as the Americans were preparing to leave, a woman approached the cabin. It was Kaltenbrunner's mistress, Countess Gisela von Westarp. She had been out walking and had not seen the American soldiers surrounding the property. As she walked up the snowy path, she saw the tall man standing in the doorway. Relieved to see him, she instinctively and affectionately called out his real name, Ernst. The word hung in the freezing mountain air like a physical weight. The American intelligence officer froze. He looked at the woman. Then he slowly turned his head and looked back at the polite country doctor. The American officer didn't say a word. He simply stepped closer to the tall German. He looked past the man's soft civilian sweater. He looked closely at the man's face. The American officer noticed the deep, unmistakable, aggressive dueling scars carved into the man's cheeks. the exact scars that matched the classified photographs of the second most powerful man in the SS. The illusion shattered into a million pieces in a fraction of a second. The American officer did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply unholstered his sidearm, looked the terrifying giant of the Nazi regime directly in the eyes, and said, "You are not a doctor." The psychological collapse of Ernst Kaltenbrunner was absolute and instantaneous. For years, this man had projected an aura of complete, untouchable terror. He had ordered the suffering of millions without ever blinking an eye. He believed he was the ultimate superior human being, infinitely smarter than the working-class American boys standing on his porch. But looking into the cold, unforgiving eyes of the American GIs, the towering architect of the SS completely fell apart. The color drained from his face. His hands began to visibly tremble. The polite, educated persona of the country doctor completely vanished, replaced by the pathetic, shivering reality of a cornered coward. The American soldiers did not treat him with the respect of a military officer. They did not care about his massive wealth or his high society mistress. They treated him exactly like the criminal he was. They roughly spun the giant man around, disarmed him, and placed him under heavy arrest. As the American soldiers marched him down the freezing mountain, Kaltenbrunner's arrogant dignity was entirely stripped away. He stumbled in the snow. He looked back at his comfortable cabin, realizing that his grand, brilliant escape plan had been entirely dismantled by the sheer vigilance of a few exhausted American farm boys. His journey down that mountain was the beginning of the end. The Americans did not hide him away. They threw him into the back of a standard military vehicle and transported him to a high-security holding facility. From there, the man who had once been the most feared shadow in Europe was transported to the city of Nuremberg. He was forced to stand trial before the entire world. When Kaltenbrunner sat in the courtroom at Nuremberg, stripped of his black uniform, stripped of his terrifying power, and forced to listen to the undeniable evidence of his actions, his true nature was finally exposed for history to judge. He did not stand tall and defend his ideology. He did not show the fanatical bravery he had demanded from his own soldiers. Instead, the giant of the SS wept. He cried openly in the courtroom. He completely denied his involvement in the regime. He blamed everything on his superiors. He blamed everything on his subordinates. He desperately, pathetically begged for his life, acting like a victim of circumstance. But the Allied judges and the American military were completely unmoved by the tears of a monster. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of crimes against humanity. The man who thought he could outsmart the world by drinking tea in a mountain cabin was escorted to the gallows, where he faced the ultimate, inescapable consequence of his actions. There is a profound, unforgettable lesson hidden in the quiet capture of Ernst Kaltenbrunner. We often imagine the villains of history as fearless, unyielding titans who stand by their dark convictions to the very bitter end. We picture them going down fighting, maintaining their terrifying aura until their last breath. But the exhausted American soldiers who climbed that freezing mountain in Austria discovered the ultimate truth about tyranny. They discovered that beneath the tailored uniforms, beneath the gleaming silver medals, and beneath the terrifying, boastful propaganda, the men who build empires of cruelty are almost always the exact same thing. They are cowards. When their power is stripped away, and they are forced to look directly into the eyes of ordinary, free men who refuse to be intimidated, their superiority complex instantly evaporates. The American GIs didn't need to fire a single shot to destroy the second most powerful man in the SS. They simply needed to knock on his door, look through his lies, and force him to realize that he was no longer the master of the universe. Do you think the sheer cowardice shown by these elite commanders when they were finally caught, proves that their entire ideology was nothing but an illusion of strength? We would love to read your perspective on this in the comments below. History is not just about the massive battles fought with tanks and artillery. It is about the quiet, unyielding moments when the truth finally catches up with the wicked. If you value the authentic, uncompromising stories of the men who stood face to face with history, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. The era of tyrants may fade, but the legacy of those who stopped them will last forever. We will see you in the next chapter of history.